Welcome to the Being Known podcast with my friend, Dr. Curt Thompson.
My friend, Pepper Sweeney.
We are here to discover and explore what it means to be truly known. Hey, Curt.
Hey, Pep. Great to be back recording again.
So great. So great. We've already had, we had the opportunity, Curt and I and Amy had the opportunity this morning to spend some real nice connecting time before we started recording that I just cherish and appreciate. It's great. And I wanted to continue through today's episode. So we are talking this season, this fourth season of the Being Known podcast. We are talking about trauma. And last season, we went through Curt's newest book, The Soul of Desire. And I believe it was episode 4 of last season. We talked about trauma and shame. And I think that's probably a good place for us to start today, sort of harken back to some of those things, just to give us a ground level of where we're going to go this season. And today's episode is all about the definitions, the definitions, so we're all on the same page.
Yeah. Well, it's a great reminder, Pepper, that we had this encounter with trauma and shame in our last season. And I, as you and I were just talking about before we started our recording, the book, The Soul of Desire, is in part of its intention is to draw our attention to beauty. And that's one of the things that we're going to continue to come back around to here, even in this season, that as we talk about trauma, as we get, much more granular, much more down in the detail, that we are reminded that in the face of trauma, that we also want to remember that beauty is coming to find us. And it's coming to find us because it knows that we are traumatized. It's not just passively, negligently happening to be passing by in the neighborhood where we happen to be. It's coming to find us. That in the gospel, the beauty of our King is coming for us. And I want you all to remember that as we talk about the details, like we will today about definitions, as we talk about this, and so therefore, like chapter 4 and episode 4 of last season's podcast continues to kind of draw our attention back to beauty, even as we talk about the definitions. So I would invite you to go back and listen to that episode. That can give you a kind of a broad overview of some of the things that we're going to be talking about over the course of this entire season.
Right.
But recognizing that at all times, beauty is hovering. And beauty wants to come so that we may bathe in it. It, as we were saying earlier, it's not a thing that I want to turn to as a way to distract myself from my trauma, or to dissociate from my trauma or pretend it doesn't exist, but rather to allow beauty to become a salve.
So when you say in episode 4, you said that trauma shatters the lens through which we see our lives. So as you're talking about this salve, and I'm seeing this shattered lens, I'm somehow seeing imaging beauty kind of coming into those cracks, and helping us, helping that lens to find its way to clarity as best we can.
Right. Yeah.
And
it's easy for us in our shattering, because the lens is so fractured. It's easy for us to say, well, that's a fractured lens. I can't imagine there would be anything that I could want to look at through that lens. Right. I can't imagine that anything would come through that lens that would be of any value, let alone something of beauty. And that lens, which is the way that we tend to look at our lives in the wake of trauma, is the very portal through which the light of Jesus is coming.
Right.
And so again, just to remind our listeners that any opportunity we have to put ourselves in the path of ongoing beauty is a way for us to affirm that we are inviting and opening the door for beauty to come through and to find us in the face of things that are really difficult.
Yeah.
And I think with that in mind, we can, we're going to talk, first of all, about some fundamentals. Some of these things you will have heard before in that fourth episode of last season, but now we're going to really kind of pay a little more granular attention to these things. When we first start to talk about trauma, we talk about two defining pillars. In the clinical community, we talk about the first pillar being the perception of experiencing something. It could be a single event, it could be a series of events over time, but in those events, we have the perception of being overwhelmed. That is a physically mediated, emotionally shattering, cognitively disruptive experience in which I am overwhelmed. And, we sometimes have a hard time finding a word that's any more descriptive or detailed than the word I feel overwhelmed. And when we use that word, I think most of us who are here in the room would say, like, we kind of get what that means. And the second pillar, so there's this sense of being overwhelmed. The second pillar is this sense, this perception that I don't have any agency to change my experience. I can't do anything about it. I am powerless. So I remember when our daughter was in elementary school, and I heard about this story later. My wife told it. She heard it from some of the kids, from the people at school, that one of the administrators was in the office and they heard the kids running down the hall and they said, "The lockers are on Rachel. The lockers are on Rachel." And apparently Rachel was standing outside her locker and the lockers came loose from their bolted holdings on the wall, on the concrete block, and they fell over. And here she is. I think she's like in third grade. And she's pinned under the lockers. Now, she wasn't hurt because it wasn't like a huge, but she's overwhelmed. Like, there's nothing that she could do. But she had help. She had other third graders who were running down the hall to the teacher saying the lockers are on top of Rachel.
Right.
And apparently the teacher who was hearing it at first thought she was, with their their R's and W's are kind of like, there were, a family of walkers. The walkers were in the school. And her first thought, like, what are the walkers doing on top of Rachel? They tell them to get off. So it was the walkers who are on top of Rachel. It was the lockers. They couldn't get their RLs, whatever.
Sure.
So that's an example of, like, we're overwhelmed, but we've got help that can come. So the perception, though, is not just that I am overwhelmed. It's not just that I have no help, I have no agency, but it is my perception of this. And this is what's crucially important. Because for those of us who are outside of somebody's experience, we could look at that person and say, well, gosh, like, I don't know that you'd call that trauma. I mean, like, as I see it, like, that wasn't that how could that be overwhelming? In the sense, and the real issue is, like, what is my perception at that given moment? My perception is, and it's like when our family was going up what used to be called the Sears Tower, and now's the Willis Tower in Chicago, and they've constructed these big extending acrylic glass blocks that go out at the observation deck. They go out and they're clear. You can look right to the street below, like 105 or 10 stories or however it is. And, you can walk out into these cubes, and, it's like you're suspended out over the edge of the building. And we got there. My son walked out. My wife walked out. I took one step and I couldn't go because my brain is looking through the glass to 110 floors below onto the street. And I'm like, no, that's really stupid. And I had to put my foot on the glass and work my way out while my son is like, he's jumping up and down out in the glass. And like, I'm about to like pass out because I'm perceiving something now, like there's all the structure. It's all like, no, you're not going to fall to the ground. Like, but my perception is this is lunacy.
Yeah.
And so perception is a really powerful thing. And so it's really important for us as we are, because some of us even would say about our experiences, like, I shouldn't be overwhelmed. I feel it, but like there's something wrong with me. So I'm going to act as if I wasn't. I'm going to act as if like that never happened. I'm going to act as if the brutality that took place in my kitchen when I watched my father beat my brother to a pulp, I'm going to pretend that like it didn't happen to me. So I shouldn't somehow be like upset by this. So perception, and then this perception of absence of agency, right? There, the age old story of, all you need to do is to take a newborn elephant and tie its leg to a stake that's in the ground that it can't move, and you'll have it for life, because by the time that elephant is an adult, it still perceives that it is unable to move the stake, even though it could pull it up and go with it at will, because there is a perception in that elephant's mind. There's a perception in my mind that I am unable to do anything. And then sometimes it's true, right? Sometimes I'm a 10-year-old kid and I can't fight off the brutality of my parents in the kitchen. I can't do that. Like, that is true. The challenge is that then I'm now 40 years old and I still feel like I'm 10. And my perception is really quite durable. So that's really an important thing to recognize, that perception is important. And so we can't just say to a person, oh, well, now that you're 40 and you're no longer 10, this shouldn't be a problem for you anymore.
Right.
And so we're going to get to this in the application portion at the end of our time, because so many of us have moments of being overwhelmed that we simply don't pay attention to. We just kind of move right past them, but we collect them. And what we're ultimately talking about here then is that when we talk about this degree of perceived, what I call perceived violence or violation. Now, when the lockers fell on our daughter, the lockers themselves were not intending to do violence to her. Right? There was no intention in that sense. But if you're Rachel, like, you do feel a bit violated, like when the lockers are laying on top of you, right? There's this again, the perception of violence that is being perpetrated.
Right. Those walkers probably loosened the bolts of the lockers so that the kids were all screaming, the walkers are on Rachel. I understand. It's a tough moment.
Oh my gosh. Right. And so there is this sense, though, that in each case where trauma takes place, what we're really talking about is that there is a rupture of some form and no repair.
Right.
In our first season, I think it was, maybe our second season, we talk about this notion of rupture and repair. Mm-hmm. When we talk about attachment, about how secure attachment is built not just in the absence of any ruptures, but when those ruptures that do occur, when they are fully and durably repaired. And with trauma, those ruptures that take place in small collected ways or that take place in singular incidents, they don't get repaired. And maybe they don't get repaired because someone didn't come back and apologize, or sometimes they don't get repaired because it just takes a long time for the repair to take place. I had a friend when I was in high school. When we were in high school, his family, his father owned a gas station, and I'll never forget. I think we were juniors in high school. It's a very small town, and all the sirens were going off, fire, right, so forth and so on, and the gas station tanks had exploded. Oh. And my friend's dad was caught inside the gas station. And he lived, but he sustained third-degree burns over like 85% of his body. Mm. And the road back took years. And I remember, I knew his dad, and I remember eventually meeting him again and talking with him and so forth. And you can see the scarring that's taking place. Sure. And it's you're a young high school student. It's overwhelming. And so the repair for him was not something that was going to take place in a day or in a year. And he went on to have multiple surgeries, right, for grafting and so forth and so on. Like that's the kind of, that kind of a thing is a traumatic event in which the repair is not easily completed, but the intention toward repair is also equally important.
Yeah, it makes me think of all the scars that we don't see, of the kind of traumas that we don't see that people are walking around with. Right. That need the same kind of care and attention.
Right. Right.
The same kind of grafting. Right.
Right. Right. You know, just this week, as you and Amy and I were talking about, just this week, I saying like I had this kind of moment of epiphany, which I'm like, oh my gosh, like I just have dozens of moments every day in which I'm anxious about what, you know, in the moment that I'm anxious, it feels really intense. But what do? I might say, oh, I feel overwhelmed by this anxiety about a small thing. But what do I just pass by it. I just move by. I just keep going. And in that sense, we might say, oh, I have agency to change it, but that's not necessarily agency to address the source of my anxiety itself. I'm just distracting myself from it.
Right.
I'm just moving on. And anybody who's around me, they'd have no idea that I'm anxious. Most people would not describe me as an anxious guy. Underneath, right, just below the surface of I'm anxious all the time. Not in a way that keeps me from functioning, but in a way that I found effective means to dissociate from, distract myself from, just keep moving on. But I have to burn energy to contain all that.
Sure.
And in this sense, we like, so to your point, like I was in a gathering once in which we were talking about, you know, these confessional communities that we do. And one of the participants in the gathering was saying, well, gosh, you know, the people that you talk about in your book, they seem like, you know, when they're talking about their stories, they seem like these are folks who are like, they really need to be in these groups because their stories would lead us to believe that they're in trouble. Like they have these challenges, like, well, like, what do you do for like folks like us? And I said, like, no, you need to understand the people that you read about in the books, they are you.
Right.
These are the people who, if you were to meet them in the street or have them in your boardroom, which you probably do, these are the people whose lives are underneath the radar, experiencing all kinds of stuff that nobody knows. But they're burning energy, the likes of which they keep hidden until they end up in my office, or they end up in a pastor's office, or something like this happens. And so it's important to know then that when we talk about trauma, and we'll get to this a little later in our recording today, we need to recognize that there are those things that are going on perhaps in all of us that we've worked really hard to just kind of keep at bay. I have 3 stories that we could talk about that give us a representation of these things. The first story, because we like to talk about trauma in different forms, we talk about trauma form A, like this form of trauma in which basically there were things that we didn't receive in life that we should have received. Now, these are, again, in both these cases, when I say both trauma A and trauma B, sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's not obvious at all. Trauma A involved my friend Greg, who grew up in a home in which both of his parents were heroin addicts. And he had 2 younger brothers, Greg did. And from the time Greg could remember, his job was to survive long enough to keep his brothers from losing their lives. And in order for Greg to do that, of course, he wasn't getting nurtured from his parents. In order for Greg to do that, Greg had to just get life done every day. And he can remember back to the time when he was about 8 years old, where he was already cooking meals in the evening.
Right.
And if you ask Greg a lot of things about what he feels, he would say, well, I don't feel bad about that. I don't feel bad about it. I don't have any memory of feeling bad about things. Like you just had to get on with life. Now we might say that, well, there were these things that parents were doing to him. Actually, when his parents were not mean, they were not brutal, they were not angry people. They were just absent. They were just AWOL in many respects. And so Greg grows up to, of course, as fate would have it, to marry a woman who is kind and who is emotionally available and connected, and she's married now to a guy, Greg, who gets it done, right? Greg is like, because I've been getting it done since I was 8. But there's just a lot on his landscape that is missing. And so here she is, like the missing part of his puzzle. Only he comes to find out that now that you're married to the person who has all this emotional awareness and intensity, and she's like in your life, she wants more from you, and like he can't deliver. And now marriage becomes really difficult because Greg can't access things that he never had. And as we start to talk about it with him, he can't even name the things that he can't name because so much of it's missing. And so that's one form in which trauma happens to us through negligence.
And that's trauma A.
That's trauma A, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Trauma B is a different form in which we talk about things that happen to us that shouldn't happen to us. I have a friend, Sam, who's in his mid to late 30s. This is a guy who had a graduate degree, married with kids, loved his life in which he was flourishing. And he was at the wrong place at the wrong time and was kidnapped, held in a trunk of a car for 3 days.
What?
Like, you can't make this up. And his life has not ever been the same since then. In this sense, he was overwhelmed and unable to be helped. And this would be what we would call a single incident. This would be trauma B, but type 1, right? It is a form in which we're like a single incident that happens to somebody.
Right.
And we can many, some of us who are listening, we might think of a single incident. I might have been in a bad traffic accident. I might have been in a fire like my friend's father was. There may have been other things, these incidents that take place that I can name. And, we will in future episodes, we'll talk about intervention and treatment and so forth, all the things that we do about this. But it is to say that we can have these single incidents that sometimes for different people can have different effects. So you can have two people who are in the car and in the same accident, and one person has a very different response to it. But we in our audience, we some of us are listening. We're like, yeah, I can name this particular thing that took place. And again, remember, perception is really important, because it's tempting for us to say, well, because I wasn't in that gas station fire, my single incident that has somehow undone me, like that's not my incident isn't bad enough to be like, it shouldn't be traumatic. It's not like, because we start to compare our traumas with other people's traumas, which we want to say is completely, I want to completely dissuade people from doing this. And so we then have this third form, this type 2 of trauma B. This is what we call complex trauma, where things can happen over long periods of time. My friend Julia, who was a person who, there are all kinds of things about this person's story, but they found themselves being sexually both first groomed and then sexually mistreated from the time they were in middle school. But it took place primarily in the context of a religious school. And, this took place 5 decades ago. And it may have been a time when culturally we were less aware of things and so forth and so on, but it's still the case that, and this took place probably over a period of 5 to 6 years. And it wasn't even brought to light until after she left school, and there were other people who had also been groomed and mistreated by the same person. And it wasn't until they came out with their story that, Julia was able to finally go back and talk about it. And the whole notion that the trauma, again, this sense of shattering, it's not just what's happening to me, but my sense of what I'm able to do about this and having any agency or not doing any of these kinds of things, which is what brings us to this point where it's really important for us to recognize that people can experience a trauma. Like I can be in the auto accident. I can be in the fire. I can be in combat. And I may not experience it as traumatic. Not everybody experiences the same event in the same way.
Right.
And so, given that being the case, we want to approach this always with a spirit of humility, in not saying, well, my experience, just wasn't that bad. It wasn't as bad as George's or Sam. Like, it wasn't like Greg's or Sam's or Julia's. And so like, what do I have to complain about? Nor can we say, well, gosh, your experience wasn't that bad. Like, why are you like, I don't understand why you're having so much trouble. Like, you shouldn't be having this much trouble. Remember that part of, and we'll talk in just a moment, these kinds of traumatic things, these violations that take place, these are in many respects not like unto what happened to my daughter Rachel when the lockers fell on her.
Mhm.
Now, those kinds of things can happen, but with Rachel, like somebody came to her aid. If this had happened when she was alone in the hallway and nobody else was in the school that she couldn't call to, the whole sense of perceiving that like, there's nothing I can do, can generate felt senses within us that like, I can't do much about this. And so then we walk, like eventually, like I can have this felt sense of like, I'm powerless under certain conditions. I can feel like I'm powerless, but like I get to be an adult and I realize like, well, gosh, I'm like, I shouldn't have this feeling anymore. I'm not in third grade anymore. Like, why do I have this sense that under certain conditions, like I'm not going to be okay? And so it's important to recognize that it's tempting for us, and evil will want to do this, to have us condemning ourselves or condemning others for somehow having an experience that we shouldn't be having. And therefore, I often won't talk about it, won't seek help for it. And because I don't seek help for it, I continue then to have to work at containing those parts of me, those experiences that I've had in which I have felt overwhelmed and without any agency to do anything about this. And of course, we can have folks that have, mixed forms of this. We can have, it's not like, well, I only have one kind or I only have another kind. What's most significant is the question of who can we begin to talk with? Who can we begin to become connected with? Who can help us with these things? Remember, the key to being overwhelmed and unable to have agency to change it is the degree to which I experience isolation within the context of my experience. And what we're really wanting to be able to do is to know that someone can come for me in some way, shape, or form. I don't know if there's anything more that you have to say about that or not.
Well, I would like to just,
Yeah.
You, in hearing these stories, in particular, Julia's story, it's, there but for the grace of God go I. I pretty much, my childhood, there was a lot of, came out years later that, I was tiptoeing through the minefield of pedophilia. I mean, it was all around. There was someone in our neighborhood that, it's not my story, so I can't tell that story, but there was, I went to Catholic school, and the diocese has recently released a list of sexual predators, and I recognize a lot of the names on that list. One particular, I had a lay teacher who, I see it now. I was being groomed. He kept me after school told me he was practicing to be a priest, and wanted me to confess my sins to him. And if I did a good job, he would take me out to Ponderosa for a steak lunch or a early steak dinner after school. Right. And, you think of the system that allowed that to happen, adults knew that I was staying after school, and then I was being taken out for a steak and a shake. But now that would be completely inappropriate. And I think that then we didn't, all this stuff hadn't come out. So we didn't really know this was going on.
Right.
And I just thank God that, I stayed after, I remember 2 times I stayed after and was asked these incredibly personal questions to a young, I think I was in 7th grade. And then it, something thankfully in me was just like, this doesn't feel right. I shouldn't be in this situation. And so that day, I said, I can't, I'm not able to go out to dinner, afterwards. That's how creepy it felt to me. And I actually walked home from school, which was usually a bus ride. So it was, it's a couple of miles away. But I'm so thankful that, that was avoided. And I think about someone like Julia that had to go through something like that. And, just awful.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there's there's so much of that, that takes place. And we wonder about the number of people who are hearing this now who've had some version of grooming, like what you were experiencing, some version of this.
Well, and, I think about, I think about the fact that, I walked away, but this person is now on a list that says that everybody didn't walk away.
Right.
Everybody didn't get to escape from that.
Right.
And yeah.
And, I want to say also too about definitions. One of the things that happens with all this is kind of given our culture, and there is a what I would consider, we've talked about these two pillars, and we've talked about then these two forms, A and B, and these subtypes of type 1. But there's also another counterintuitive story that is in play that we have to be aware of as part of this. As we like to say, evil does its best work in the middle of good work being done. And for such a long time, we really didn't pay attention to trauma as it was. And now that we're beginning to pay attention to trauma in ways that we actually should,
right,
evil is going to jump on that bandwagon and hijack it in a different way. And one of the ways that it has done it in our culture is that it has created what I would consider to be, there are elements of our culture that has now become the offended culture. So that now we have elements in our experience in which we become so concerned about not hurting anyone that we've now moved to even parenting in ways that actually prevents resilience from developing, because we're going to make sure that nobody gets their feelings hurt for absolutely any reason. And so we create elements within all for the purpose of really protecting against trauma, which is all a good thing. The pendulum swings through the apex of its arc to the other side. And now we create elements of narcissism and fragility, all of which is the outgrowth of good intentions. And in many respects is also the necessary logical conclusion to kind of hyper individualism that is part of our culture. Like, I can't tolerate being offended, and so I am. And so I have 100,000 different ways in which I now am going to make sure that that you don't do anything to offend me, because I've learned that I can't take it. And in both instances, both trauma itself, that is real trauma that people experience, and the offended culture, both are results of disconnection. Trauma happens, and remember, it's the perception of either being overwhelmed or whatever. Like, that happens because I'm not connected. At some point, something wasn't connected in your school, such that somebody was aware of somebody who was grooming people.
Right.
But then when we swing through the other side, like when we create a culture of the offended, it means that those folks also are kind of like left on their own to figure things out. And we're not connected enough to say, like, no, we can do hard things. We can sustain hard things. And we then learn that all of this together, evil is going to use this to create what we would call both systemic as well as systematic trauma. And by systemic, we mean it begins in Genesis 3. We've often said that there is no more ancient traumatic system than the male-female system, where males do what they do to females and females do what they do to males, over and back and forth with all the things that the curse talked about. From the very beginning, we've had all kinds of traumatic social structures take place, but none is older than what men and women do to each other. But largely, in many respects, we would say, as we say, like, the first act of safety that a man has to commit when it comes to being married and having a family is like, I have to protect people from myself. That's what I have to do. But I can't do that very well if I haven't had the experience of being protected myself by others. And so we've got this male-female thing that is a system itself. And then we have families. When you read 2 Samuel, like chapters 13 and 19, many of us are familiar with, maybe not. I would say, like, go read about it. And you're like, Hollywood can't beat the Bible in terms of stories of brutality, stories of violence,
right,
in the context of the very families that God is trying to use to bring wholeness and redemption to the world. When you read about Judah and Tamar, Judah's Tamar's father-in-law, and he sets her up for failure. And in the end, she is like relegated to prostitution, and he sleeps with her. And she becomes pregnant.
Take that, Jerry Springer.
And in this way, we have this sense in which even in families, it becomes systemic and systematic. We then do things on purpose. Judah had a choice. Judah could have done things differently in this family, in which he was kind of the rising patriarch. Then we lead to see, like, extended, like not just families, but communities. In John chapter 9, we see Jesus has this encounter with a blind guy. And at the end of the chapter, we see this isn't just the trauma that happened to a blind person. This is trauma that the entire culture of his neighbors, of his system, was perpetrating upon him. It was systematic. And then we have our own particular story in the U.S., the cultural setting of chattel slavery, which, of course, again, it's our own particular story, but like, we in the U.S. are just descendants of the shadow of empire. When you read Persian Fire by Tom Holland, it's the story of the Persian Empire, and you're like, in their day, they were just gobbling up cities and countries, like, and killing hundreds of thousands of people. Not to mention the Romans. You talk about trauma, where the Romans put literally thousands of people to death by crucifixion. And we want to look back and say, gosh, we are the heirs of Rome and Greece. God, and we're so pleased to be heirs of the people who came up with the idea of crucifying people. Mm. And we're all, of course, descendants of Eden, where all this stuff becomes, started. And I just want to say that it circles back to this notion of, it begins with individuals. It takes place with an individual, like Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, that grows out into the violence of the culture that we read about in the first 10 or 11 chapters of Genesis. And so it becomes systemic, but it's always a function of intimacy. So even if I get T-boned in the middle of an intersection, even if the lockers fall onto Rachel, the essence of what's going to happen is, who's going to come for me? Who is going to be the relationship? Who's going to see me? Who sees Hagar in the desert when twice she is sent out? She runs out, and then who sees her? Behold, the God who sees me. Which is why we talk so much about embodiment and sexuality as trauma being so deeply embedded in that, because it's the emblem of intimacy. It is the physical exploration and expression of our most intimate, fragile, vulnerable selves. And it's out of this that we move to protect and then do violence to others in traumatic ways. And so there is this rhythmic pattern between the intimacy of two individuals, like what was happening between you and the teacher, that is also then in rhythmic pattern and systemically being applied in an entire system that supports that then swings back around to the individual actions that are taking place, that are drawn up into the system that supports it. And all these things that we're doing make it sometimes, well, even when we start to talk about it, listener, I'm just saying that when if you're listening now, you might have this sense of like, I'm feeling overwhelmed even as I hear this episode. And I want to remind us that beauty is coming for us. It's into the middle of this space of trauma, whatever form it is, whether it's neglect, whether it's active brutality. Beauty is coming for us. The Holy Trinity is not satisfied to leave us where we are. Jesus himself knows what it means to have the experience of being traumatized. And in many respects, we would say those of us who know of trauma, whether it's blatant and obvious, or whether it's that form of trauma that just happens multiple times a day in the privacy of our own mind that we bury and don't pay attention to, so that nobody would know. Maybe I don't even know. That the moment that we begin to wake up to its reality, we also wake up to the notion that, oh, this is what it was like to be Jesus. It's not just that we know that Jesus can say, I know what it's like to be you. He can say, I know what it's like to be him. And how else is it like to be him, to have a Father and a Spirit that is coming for us, that is present with us, that never leaves us or forsakes us, even in the moments of our worst, most heinous experience of trauma. And so as we've talked about these definitions and explored elements of it that are nuances of it, and I want us to just know that God made the world knowing that trauma was coming. And at the end of the day, he knew that he would step into its path and that he would take it and absorb it so that he could then give us a very different kind of hope on the backside of Good Friday. And we want our listeners to know that beauty and hope are coming, and they're here. And they want to bathe us in themselves.
That's awesome, Curt. As we wrap up this episode, what in your mind, we like to do these applications after every episode so that we can go a little deeper and make things, a little more practical, maybe.
Right.
Right. So what did you have in mind for this week?
So last week, we invited our listeners to just begin to be curious about, do you have an awareness of where trauma might have shown up for you? This week, we recognize that sometimes that very exercise can evoke things in us that are really kind of hard, difficult, or we're even just kind of puzzled. And this week, what I really want us to do practically is just to be curious about those two pillars that we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
The pillar of being overwhelmed, to just be curious about it. Most of us, when we feel overwhelmed, we just immediately want to do whatever we can to get out of it. I really want us. Yes, I see that smile.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
If I'm overwhelmed, if the water's coming up over my nose and the weights are on my feet, I want to get the weight off my feet and I want to get out. I mean, what's wrong with that? I perceive that you're saying that's wrong. So my perception is
it's like, wait, no, I want to observe my hyperventilation. I want to observe the water coming into my nose.
Yeah.
Curt, I'm just going to do some meditative breathing here. Oh, no, wait, I can't.
Because I have to just perceive it. Okay. No, tell me. So,
well, I think it's important for us to practice paying attention to moments and places where we felt overwhelmed. To practice paying attention to that. And just listing those things and observing them in small moments. It doesn't have to be in big moments, but becoming familiar with where trauma might lie in very small ways.
You had
multiple
said,
ways.
You had said, I love this illustration. You had said that you talked about a bruise and how if you biopsy a bruise on the arm or, on the body, you take it out and you buy it just looks like trauma. I mean, it's just, but
carnage.
Carnage, right? But it's surrounded by good, healthy material that's going to help it heal. And it's really not, but it is trauma.
Right.
It is. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the degree to which we then go from naming what we're overwhelmed by to then also name, like, what is it like for me to feel powerless? Right. That's the other pillar. How do I experience powerlessness? Where do I sense it in my body? What are the thoughts that come to me? How do I picture it in my mind? What are the settings? What do I feel powerless? Are there moments in my marriage? Are there moments in my parenting? Are there moments with my boss or my employee? Are there moments in my neighbors? Well, like, where do I feel powerless? And like, my parents might not even be alive, but like, do I still, when I think about them, like, oh gosh, that felt sense of powerlessness with my mom or with my dad still comes. What do we do about that? And then the third, so listing these things again, not to figure out what to do with them yet, but just to be aware of them so that we don't have to be afraid of them. And then last, who are going to be your conversation partners? Name one or two people. This doesn't have to be a whole group, doesn't have to be a room full of people. One or two people that you could share this information with and that they can share it with you. Because in so doing, your mind, your heart, your body becomes connected. And remember, trauma is primarily, for something to become traumatic, it has everything to do with the degree to which I'm disconnected from within myself and from other people, which is why I end up feeling overwhelmed and powerless to begin with. And so we're listing the felt sense of overwhelm, the number of places. We're listing my experience of powerlessness, how that presents itself to me. And then we're going to take those and we're going to share that with somebody else and connect that to our stories.
Great. Okay. I'm on it.
Right, brother.
Appreciate you.
Love you, man.
Love you.
Okay.
Till next week.
Till next week.
One of the things that struck me is, so there's the trauma. And of course, when we're talking about trauma, then I think about my A trauma and my B trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, okay, so we have these experiences, but then so incredibly powerful is our experience of the experience. Like,
right.
10 people could have the same experience. Lockers fall on them.
Right.
And depending on our experience of that, who comes for us, what happens, that's so powerful. And also, it's not like, if somebody, like the whole idea of rupture and repair, like if the repair is so powerful, that repair can be done 10 years later.
Right. Right.
And like thinking of A and B trauma, a couple of things. And I thought, okay, have I really looked somebody in the eye and told, they're not anything you both of you probably know, but it's like, do we tell someone, not just like as a side story or a, this or that, but do we look someone in the eye and say, this is what that was?
Right. Right. Well, I even think about, so evil kind of gets us coming and going in the sense that, like, so for the story of Julia, like who is she going to tell that story to? Right. Or like Pepper, like even now as adults, like who wants to tell the stories of like really like horrendous trauma?
Right.
Because of the shame that we've experienced as a result of it. I don't want to name it for that reason. And then on the other side of the spectrum is like, so like these little moments of anxiety that I'm discovering that I have that are just like everywhere. I don't want to talk about them either, because I feel like in a previous conversation, we were like, when am I going to like grow up and like this not be a problem anymore?
Right. Yeah.
Like, wait a minute. As it turns out, it's not about growing up. Like, in fact, I can't grow up if I don't actually return and look at that very space and be present with it. Be curious about it. Welcome that experience into the room instead of trying to dissociate from it or get rid of it or just go past it or whatever.
Yeah. And then we can create beauty. Like when we tell someone and experience someone coming toward us. Yeah.
It's funny. I have a friend who lives in Ashland, Ohio, Terry Wardle is his name, and he is the age that my youngest of my 3 older brothers would be if he were still living. And I met Terry about 4.5 years ago. And I have found in Terry to be the older brother that I've never had. Like the like the person who, like, I've got, like, I only know brothers, like, experientially in my own family. I only know them to be kind of like uncles. Really, I don't really know them to be brothers. Like, they're, we're in the house together, we're all the things, right? Oh, brothers or sisters. And you don't, like, I realize that, like, I grew up in living in a world in my mind as if, like, I wouldn't have known this when I was 10 or 17. I wouldn't have had words for this, but the sense in which, like, I'm responsible for my well-being, for my emotional well-being. Like, I like this is like the narrative that gets created without words, but this, and the whole notion that someone would be interested enough in me to come and find me. When, unless I send a signal that says, "Hey, could we talk?" Hey, like, right. But I still got to initiate it. I gotta check on that, and I gotta let you know that I could. And then when I do, then, like, yeah, we'll talk about your. We were at a conference. We'd known each other for a little while, and we were speaking at a conference together. We were staying in the same hotel, and I had arrived, and he was going to meet me, and we were going to go for dinner. And usually, they yell, "Meet me at the restaurant," or whatever at the hotel. And I hadn't seen him yet. I come down the elevator door opens, and you know how in places where the elevator doors open, they'll have like a coffee table and a couple of chairs sitting there. I don't really know why people do that. I mean, like, people are just sitting there in the coffee, like, having coffee, like,
so you
outside.
have a convenient place to discuss the ups and downs of life.
Oh, very good.
Oh my gosh.
That's very good. That's very good.
Kind of. I mean,
that's very good.
That's good.
That's good. But
It's not my best.
I step off the elevator. The doors open, and there sits Terry.
Oh,
waiting.
He's waiting for you.
Waiting for me. Nobody asked him to. Like, I didn't say, "I'll meet you at the bottom of the elevator." There was no, like, and I got to tell you, like, it. Like, it's like somebody had, like, I had this moment. It's like somebody had saved me from drowning. And I returned to this, like, it just gets, it gets right here in my throat. I return to this, like this sense that somebody's coming unsolicited, waiting, looking, but who's like 10, 12 years my senior, who in many respects is like an older brother, somewhere between that and, like, being a young, a father, something of that nature.
Yeah.
And that whole sense that, like, you don't know where your trauma has lived until somebody, like, does something that lets you know that, like, this is the thing that I have never had, that I didn't know that I never had, until you have it.
Right. You didn't know you needed it until you had it, or wanted it until you got it. It's like, yes, that's it.
Right. Right. Like, I think, I think, like, so for me, like, your, Pepper, you and Amy, your collective and corporate, like, all the things that you, all the things about this podcast, I feel like you guys come for me. Like, and there are these small, like, you might say death of 1,000 dramatic cuts that little by little by little by little by little get bathed in the beauty of the work that we're doing. It's a big deal for me. I feel like it's, it's like I get to do the podcast and I'm doing rehab at the same time. I mean, sorry that you're not getting paid any more than you are for this, for all the work you're doing.
Yeah, but I'm not paying your fees either that I'm getting in therapy. So
Yeah, then it's like, okay, who comes for us? And then who do I go to? Who do I go find?
Yeah.
And that's a vulnerable act. And
yeah.
can be delightful.
Yeah. My wife, Phyllis, our next door neighbor, got a call last. I got a call. I forget some day last week that she's the third or fourth of 4 adult children, ranging in age from like early to mid 40s to early 50s. And the oldest sibling, 53, otherwise completely healthy, died of a sudden heart attack out of state. It's just devastating.
Oh my gosh.
And Phyllis heard the news, and she texted me and she says, I think I need to go. I got to go next door, because like we had just heard it through the email grapevine of our neighborhood. And she goes next door, and and our neighbor's daughter meets at the door, and Phyllis said, look, if she's not able to come, it's okay. But she comes and she steps outside and she just falls into Phyllis's arms and is just bawling.
Oh.
But I think she's going to need people to come and find her for weeks. That's what Phyllis did. That's what Terry did. That's what you guys do. And some of what's so difficult, of course, is we'll talk more and more about this, like this whole intimacy thing that we talked about at the end of this recording. It's so tricky because trauma takes place in that context. And so the very thing that we need for healing is remembered as the context in which the violence took place.
Right.
And so it's tricky. It takes time. It takes practice. It takes a community. I had a patient. I had a patient. I have a patient who has just had some really brutal things happen to them growing up, and then had some emotionally brutal things that happened to them within the last 3 or 4 years. And they're really it's a woman, and their relationship with men in general is iffy. And so the whole notion of doing therapy with male is also fraught with challenges. And we had this amazing conversation a couple of weeks ago where I had said something the week or two before, in which, in my enthusiasm, I was saying one thing, but she perceived it in a different way and felt misunderstood and dismissed by me. Which not only did she feel misunderstood and dismissed, but she was also really angry. She's mad about it. Now, not mad like I'm not coming back. It's not like scorched earth anger, but she was mad. And this person doesn't have practice telling a male that she's really angry. There's no so let alone let yourself feel it, let alone articulate it.
Yeah.
And in fact, we're working together with another therapist together, and the patient had talked to the other therapist, kind of practicing about what does it mean about telling Curt that I'm mad at him.
Wow.
And it was, and this would be one of those things where one might say, like, okay, so you're pissed. So go in and tell him you're pissed. What's the big deal, right?
Right.
This is how it's so easy for us to misunderstand the perception of others and the challenges that they have, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And of course, I don't know any of this is going on until the day that she walks in and she starts to talk about this.
Yay.
It was unbelievable. It was so beautiful. And I was so proud of her. And it's like I was not happy about my having to be correct it. I'm not happy about like, oh yeah, I guess I did kind of jump the gun on what I said. And like, and at the same time, like that's an example of how memory of being powerless to do anything when your system says fight or flight, right? I'm in my anger, but I'm powerless to do either of those. And now you're volunteering to come into a space where you're like, and right. They do the work.
Ugh.
And it's easy to think, oh, that's just a small thing. Like, no,
that's huge.
No, it's like moving Everest.
But in that sense, it's almost good that she felt dismissed by you, because then that gives her the opportunity. Like, look what happened. Then she was somehow able to communicate that to you. And
Kurt realizes that. That's why he's always dismissing everybody.
Right? Look on.
It's like,
hey, y'all,
I'm going to give you the opportunity.
That's right. I'm looking
for an opportunity.
That's right. I'm looking for more work. I know that it'll be another hour for you in my office.
It's huge. Because then that will give her an ounce further. Like, it's just, yeah.
I'm really struck by, again, I return to this frequently. I continue to be struck by the way I am moved by the pacing of the storytelling and screenplay and filming of The Chosen. And how, Jesus is not willing to move any faster than he's willing to move. And there are these very small moments. Like there's a moment, like I have this, this collection of moments where Philip is talking to Matthew or Jesus is talking to Thomas. And they're like these 90 to 120 second dialogue bits that it's like, oh my gosh, it's a small moment in time. But that moment is going to be the auger that digs to the center of the earth. But it's going to take it's going to be over and over and over and over again. Like these small moments that look small at first glance, but are absolutely huge in like what happens to Thomas and what happens to Matthew when he's talking to Philip. And this sense that like for my patient, like it's huge for her to be able to name her anger. Yes, I'm mad at you.
Yeah.
And and have the experience that the earth does not open and swallow her.
Right.
And it took great risk for her to do it because she doesn't know what I'm going to do.
I have a friend out in California, and early on in our friendship, we were together at a party. And unbeknownst to me, I had said something to him that, he took wrong, and there was this perception that I was being an ass, which can happen.
It's hard to
but in this particular case, it wasn't. The next day, he called me up, and he said, "I got to talk to you about something." He said, "Because I like you, and
I want to still like you.
And this happened last night, and we need to talk about this." And I immediately said, "You have no idea how much respect that I have for you right now." And I think it made us much better friends. And the fact that he said, because I could very easily just not bring this up and just let it go and just be angry and just go on. And I don't, I've got enough friends. I don't really, but he named it right away and said, "Look, this is what you did." And I'm like,
what a
I'm
gift.
so glad that you brought it up.
Yeah.
And
that's a bid for connection, right? That's
right.
Yeah. And you took the bait, right? You
Yeah, because how often will we, especially early in a relationship, somebody's a jerk and you're like, okay, next.
Yeah. Right.
I don't need to go deal with that.
Right. Well, I mean, I talked about that thing about like just repairing ruptures. It's such a big deal. And I think that we do what you just said, right? They're just like, no, I don't need to address that. I don't need to, we treat it all kind of like, the moment when I get cut off in traffic by some unknown driver, and I just like, but I'm just going to let him go. Like, I'm not going to go like repair that. But we do that with a lot of stuff that goes by, and of course, there are moments, right? Like when in marriage, these things happen on occasion. You're like, okay, like I know what this is, and I'm not like that kind of stung, but I know where this is coming from. And so there's sometimes we say it, and sometimes I'm just going to let that one go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there is this, but I wouldn't be able to just like let it go all the time. At some point, we're going to have to say, so this happened. So what's happening here?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I just got off the phone with my dad or my mom or these kinds of things. And again, those are the kinds of things where if we just simply dismiss them, that becomes those small traumatic moments that we collect, that at some point becomes a conflagration. If we're not doing the very thing, Pepper, that your friend decided to do, which is, I'm going to keep a short account.
Well, and that's it. It's also in a marriage or in a relationship, it's seeing those ruptures and then you going and talking about them.
Right.
And saying, I see how I caused whatever, it's not
right.
just going to the other person and saying, you
did
this is what you did. It's it's being self-aware enough to know outside of the heat of the moment, and going back and saying, I'm sorry, and this is what I did, this is where that came from, and this is what I think I'm working on, and those kind of things.
I had another experience. So this, the patient I just described, like I had, we might say that her experience, her perception of what was happening was one thing. If you had asked me to tell the story, I would say, oh, I have a different perception of what I was doing. I acknowledge that the way that I did it landed in a particular way that makes sense to me, and that I would want to do that differently. But I don't have some sense that like I was doing something mindless or wrong or whatever in that sense. It's just that what I did was experienced by her in a way that like she felt that, and she came back and talked to her. I'm like, yeah, I would do that differently. I would absolutely do that differently. Mm-hmm. But I don't have a sense that like I like, oh my gosh, like you're right. Like I really kind of screwed that up. Like I mistreated you in a way that I need to like do, like I need to do it differently, not just because it would be better for you, but because like I shouldn't be doing that at all.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Later this past week, I have another experience in which I have a patient who came in, wanted to, we are kind of like a person that I see once a quarter. And I could tell that like something wasn't quite right. They weren't quite as warm, quite as forthcoming.
Mm-hmm.
And she started to hint at, the bottom line is that administratively, we dropped the ball. I dropped the ball on something administratively for her that had to do with some medical stuff. And, she pointed that out, and it led to her then having some challenges with medicine and side effects and so forth and so on that were really unpleasant and scary for her and so forth and so on. And this is one of those moments in which I'm like, dang.
Yeah.
I screwed this up. Like I screwed this up. Now here's the thing. I said, and she, and of course she was soft pedaling it. She was not, she's kind of like telling me what happened, but she's not telling me anything like, and I'm really upset with you.
Right. Yeah.
She's not saying that. She's just talking about what,
Factual.
the events that happened, but she's not talking about her emotional experience of it. So to what you're saying, Pepper, I said, wait a minute. There's just no question that I dropped this ball. This is my fault. And she said, no, it's okay. I'm like, no.
Yeah.
No. It's not okay. It wasn't okay when it happened. It's not okay. It won't ever be okay. I don't ever want this to happen to you again. So to your point about when we seek to repair traumas that we are responsible for, and it's not easy for me to want to do this. I'm not looking forward to saying I've been an ass.
Right.
Yeah.
But I can say that the connection that we felt when she and I had fully repaired this. But again, many people who've been traumatized, like they're not going to say, "I'm really angry with you." You did like they're going to know it's okay. Because to say more than that is an invitation for who knows what. Like,
Even
no,
further.
I'm angry, I'm upset, right? And like, and
Yeah.
to which there's further trauma that might come. Like,
Right.
she's not going to.
Dismissive or whatever.
Right.
Yeah. Mhm.
Right. And so it behooves us when we're in the business of repairing to be able to name what it is that we've done and
Mhm.
what it has done to the other.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
And I don't want to be that person who does that. And I want you to forgive me. And going further and talking to her and saying, like, I don't want your forgiveness to be something that you do right now because you're not ready for it.
Mhm. Mhm.
Because, like, a month from now, the thing that happened last, like the prescription is going to come due, and you're going to wonder, like, is Curt going to come through?
Going to happen? Mm-hmm.
And it's going to call up old stuff, like, and I feel like, and you're going to have to forgive me again. So I know that, like, and I just want to say, like, it's okay. It might take a while. It's okay. I get it, and I just want you to know, like, I'm going to work to make sure this doesn't happen again.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I'm, it's like, even for our part, like we're imperfect. Like, I can't guarantee that I would never make a mistake again, which is like also part of the thing. Like, once I've committed an act that I want to repair, I want to repair it. But then it's like, oh my gosh, I'm like, oh, I hope I don't do this again. It's like being a parent. You hurt your kids' feelings, and
Or
you're
a
like,
husband,
hey,
or a friend, or a
we're going to do it
daughter, or
again.
a son.
We're going to do it
You're
again.
going to do it again.
That's where, if we all just stay in the room, then it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
This podcast is produced by Curt Thompson, Pepper Sweeney, and myself, Amy Chella. Audio production and editing is by Keaton Simons. Video production and editing is done by Mark Gould. If you'd like to connect with us, you can find us on social media at BeingKnownPod. If you like this podcast, tell a friend. If you love this podcast, tell everyone you know. And please like, rate, and review wherever you listen. Be well, be known.